Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this conversation from Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. We're very delighted today to have a very important event to talk about two very excellent books on global refugees that have been published over the last 2 years. And Bridgewater State University has been doing a lot of work on the studies of immigrants and refugees over the last few years. And the Millen Institute for Global Engagement is one of the campus units that support the initiative, along with the International Migration Working Group. And a number of faculty members have been organizing webinars about different issues relating to different groups of immigrants and refugees. And more recently, there have been a few webinars about Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine does not really captures the spotlight right now, but only 6 months ago, we were talking about Afghanistan. And a few years ago, we were talking about Syria, along with Myanmar. And people tend to forget that the conversation has been going on for a while, although there have been different focus and emphasis on it. So today, we actually have two scholars who have written two books about both Syria and Myanmar, and along with the larger context of resettlement of refugees in the United States. I'm very excited to have this event. And first is Jessica Gaudao, and our first author, and she has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, among many other publications. And she produced also projects for Teen Vogue program with the name Ask a Syrian Girl and A Lie Birds Cannot See, which is a documentary about a young girl who crossed the border into the US on her own. She has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas and served as a Mellon Writing Fellow and Interim Writing Center Director at Southwestern University. And Gaudao has spent more than a decade working with refugees in Austin, Texas, as the author of this is the co-founder of Hill Tribers, a nonprofit that provided supplemental income for Burmese refugee artisans for 7 years. Her book, After the Last Border, was published in fall 2020. It's an intimate look at the lives of two women and their hope and resilience as they fight to survive and belong in the United States of America. Heber Goldthwait is the Mormon Simon Assistant Professor of Sociology at Boston University, and her research, which is global and comparative, examines how low-income people traverse social services, immigration laws, and their associated bureaucracies, while grappling with gender and racial inequalities. And she's the author of the brand new book that was just released 2 weeks ago, entitled Refuge, with Princeton University Press, which explores how states shape the potential of people pursuing refuge within their borders. She's currently working on her second book, The Cost of Borders, which theorizes borders as a costly and often deadly transaction. Our discussant today, and I'll bring her in a bit, is Dr. Janet Mancini-Bilson, and she's the director of Groups Dimensions International and former professor of sociology at George Washington University and Rhode Island College, and also the Killam Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies at Bridgewater State University last year. Dr. Bilson has conducted policy research on since 1981, focusing on international development, social policy, organizational collaboration, and strategic planning. And she has a new book coming out called Refugees in the Canadian Mosaic, Their Journey to Resettlement and Hope. Last but not least, our colleague, Dr. Rachel Lavari, is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at Bridgewater State University, and she had her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and her research focuses on comparative public policy, specifically issues relating to immigration policy and politics, populism and democratic discontent, and populism. and she was a co-author of the book Immigration in the 21st Century. So again, I'm Wing Kai-to. I'm the Assistant Provost for Global Engagement for Senior International Officer at Bridgewater State. And my research interest is connecting to Chinese diaspora and Chinese American immigration. So I'll turn this to Rachel to start off.
First, remember to unmute. So basically, I am just here to help ask questions if the conversation needs it, and to help get the discussion started. But just to give a little bit more about the books, we have two very interesting books that look at the refugee situation that we're currently in a very interesting way. Dr. Godow's book basically talks about, it's a very personal, or did I say your name wrong? Yeah, I got it right. Okay. It's a very personal look at the immigration system in the United States, comparing the immigration of a member of a persecuted minority in Myanmar and a refugee from the Syrian civil war. Both are given a chance to resettle in the U.S. immigration in the U.S. In the 21st century, in a time when immigration and refugee acceptance in the United States had reached historic lows. Dr. Goya, I'm mispronouncing your name, I'm sorry. Her book is more of a comparative story while also still centering these very human narratives and what it is like for refugees dealing with this system. She looks at how Syrian men and women seeking refuge in a moment of just unprecedented refugee numbers, how they are received in the countries of resettlement and asylum, looking at the US, Canada, and Germany. And it looks especially at human capital and how the skills immigrants bring with them shapes their potential and what they can contribute to their new countries, can be either transformed, created, or utilized by the country that they are settled in, and how that country chooses to settle them. So what we're going to do to start the conversation, I'm going to turn it over to both of these very interesting authors who wrote two very interesting books, and ask you basically to give us a brief discussion of what were the key findings of your works?
How about you get started?
Sure. So thank you so much, Wing-Kai, for that introduction, and thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Jessica, for being here as well, and to our audience. And yeah, I really loved reading Jessica's book, which I had the chance to read, the invitation to read when I was invited to this panel, because I think that her and I sort of set out to do very similar things, and it's really fascinating, the different approaches to the same issue of forced displacement. So to give a little bit of a synopsis on what Refuge is about, it's a book that centers the experiences and journeys of Syrians who were forcibly displaced due to a war that, as you all know, began in 2011. And violently destroyed the country. And the war was a part of what came to be known as the Arab Spring, which was revolutions throughout the Middle East, against despotic and authoritarian rulers. And in Refuge, by centering the experiences of Syrians, I first look at how they became refugees, how they became displaced, first from their homes and then from their country, and eventually how they tried to find legal refuge in other places, which is what Jessica also does in her brilliant book. And I compare the experiences of people who were displaced who found refuge in the United States, Canada, and Germany. The United States and Canada have resettlement programs, which are state-sponsored programs that are designed to vet and admit refugees once they've already been displaced from their country of origin. And in Germany, I look at the case of asylum, which is where people make very, very difficult journeys, getting on boats, in the case of Syrians, to first getting to Turkey and then getting on boats from Turkey to cross the Aegean Sea and into Greece often, and then making really treacherous journeys throughout Europe. And of course, a lot of people die in the sea as well. And the story I'm telling, or at the center of the story I'm telling, the argument that I'm making, is that when we observe people who arrive, we have this understanding that how they do in destination countries depends on what they bring with them, right? If they work hard enough, if they bring the right skills, then surely they're going to do well. And we have this notion of the American dream here in the United States, but we have some facsimile of that notion everywhere, that, you know, people are going to arrive and they're going to do as well as their skills allow them. And what I show in Refuge is that it really depends on how people are received, that welcome is more than just opening the door, more than just admission, that what you have to do is you have to offer people services. You have to see them as full people with human potential, with aspirations, with possibilities, with dreams. And you have to invest in them on those same parameters. So you have to provide them with the financial assistance to be able to benefit from all the riches that we have here in the United States or in Canada or in Germany. You need to be able to help them learn the language. You need to recognize that people experience trauma both in the process of displacement, but also continue to experience trauma when they, you know, come face to face with national systems that, you know, are not necessarily seeing them as full human beings. And so the story that I tell in Refuge, and I use the term human capital, but I really rethink the term human capital, right? Which is to say that human capital or people's abilities can be created, transformed, or destroyed by the states receiving them, and by those states' willingness to sort of invest in and recognize them. And it was really fascinating. And I really want to hear Jessica's summary of her book, because it was really fascinating that we had very similar themes in terms of sort of the human and the meaning that of refuge for people who just really want a better life, and whether they're able to construct that or not, and what that construction really takes in terms of emotions, time, dedication, but also their relationships with other people, both people that they love within their own families, within their own communities, but also people in these destination countries where they arrive. And I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Let's take a minute and just help everybody out too, as someone who also has, I mean, I love being in spaces with people that come from international places, because no one has ever pronounced Godot correctly, and no one ever will. So I'm Jessica Godot, just so that everybody knows. Have us say your name so we can all say it correctly.
Hiba Goayed.
Okay, perfect. So just to help you out when you talk about this later, you can just be like, oh, these are the people that I know, and you know how to say their last names, because it's always the worst. I have so much to say about this book, so I'm going to hold on to it for a second, because as you were talking, I'm already like turning to my little, I ran out of stickies, which was really a problem for me. For me, I would say, I have a hard time sometimes with the idea of key findings, because this book is not an academic book. So I come from academia. I'm very comfortable with academia, and I wrote this book in a way that was very outside of that. For me, this is this is rhetoric, this is journalism. And so I would say more, this is a narrative argument. And I feel like that's a lot of where our books really intersect. We come to these from two different disciplines, but we're making the same argument, which is these are people at the heart of these policies. And so often we get so caught up in our systemic thinking that we assume we know what it means to be a refugee. We assume the cream will rise, good refugees will come and do well. And if they didn't do well, that's because of some kind of internal or individualistic failure on their part. And both of us were trying to really show how these systems are deeply stacked against people who are just trying to be safe and be with their families, right? And so for me, what I thought was maybe the most interesting finding in this, I braid three sections together narratively. One is the story of Hasna, one is the story of Muna, who came in 2007. Sometimes I have to go back and check. And she's someone that I have known for a long time. We were close friends when this process started. One is the story of Hasna, who came in 2016. And one is the history of the refugee resettlement policy in the US, beginning basically with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so looking from the 1880s until now, in as readable a way as I could, and then trying to really shorten it so that it's something that you can just take in these kind of bite-sized chunks to just explain what was happening around these two women's stories. What I thought was so fascinating is I went in thinking, political science people are going to absolutely understand this. I thought I was going to have a fairly dry history of policies, that this was about this law happened here and this law happened here. And instead I found it was a very dynamic history of the way that the US feels about people and how that then impacted our policies. So it was capricious and tumultuous, and it was more about the large scale movements that we make. If you've ever seen those documentaries where they show large migrations of birds and they kind of change course. That to me is like the great metaphor for the way that the US feels. We want to be a nation who receives people. Refugee resettlement is open. We're tired of people coming and taking our jobs. Refugee resettlement is closed. And so understanding the capricious nature of the US public's views of others, and that these are bounds, as Heba so very beautifully shows in this, in her book, that this is not just about people coming for refuge, but people who are caught up in our views of race and of gender and of all these other kind of intersectional identities, that they end up being caught in this massive machine that has very little to do with them. So yeah, there's a lot we're gonna talk about. Rachel, I know you had one more question. What was your question before Heba and I jump in?
So our other question was also, what brought you to these projects? We always talk about findings, but what got you interested in this question and in this story as well?
Heba, you want to start?
Sure. I was gonna ask you to start, but I'll start. My story, my pathway to this book was really circuitous. I write about this a little bit in the book, but I am Egyptian. I'm also an academic, and I thought my dissertation project, my sociological dissertation project, was going to be about poverty alleviation policy in Cairo. And I was in Cairo doing that work, and really due to the same sort of political factors that ended up in the war that I ended up studying, or the displacement that I ended up studying, my field access was rescinded, and it became unsafe for me to stay in the country, and I left. And I've been back since. It's not like I'm exiled or anything, but it was a situation in which it became kind of hostile to researchers. And so as a result of that abrupt ending of my field work, I came back to the United States, and I didn't have a project. And this was in the 4th year of what should be a 6-year PhD. So it was not an opportune time for this to happen. But at the same time, I had become super fascinated and just completely overtaken by watching Syrians leave their country and cross the Aegean Sea and make their way into Europe. And this was happening around 2015. And I had been to Syria. I'm Arab, I'm an immigrant. I had also been to Syria in 2009, 2010. People were so kind and so welcoming. And I just felt wrenched that people who had been so warm, who had come, who had invited me to eat their delicious food, and who had really welcomed me into their country, were having this horrific thing happen to them. And when I heard that Syrians were being resettled in New Haven on MSNBC one morning, as I was sort of moping on the couch, upset at my, loss of my dissertation project, I called the resettlement agency. I actually went to a fair that was happening in the city that the resettlement agency was at, and I told them that I was interested in interpreting and perhaps doing this as a project, right? Seeing what the experience are of people arriving. And through the next few months, of talking to them, they allowed me to sort of, begin to observe the work of the resettlement agency. And from there, I met all of these families, eventually distancing myself from the resettlement agency, but continuing to follow their stories. And it's so interesting because I was never an immigration person before I began this project. I'm interested in policy. I'm interested in, in money. And whether people have it or don't, and who has access to it. And I think that the lack of knowledge about immigration policy is really what what made this book sort of what it was, because I became surprised. I was really earnestly surprised at some of the things that I was seeing. And I think that surprise and being able to sort of follow my gut rather than having a theoretical framing at the outset really benefited me, even though I didn't intend for it to sort of unfold this way. And I'm an ethnographer. I care about humans. That's why I got into this. I like to write, and I care about people's stories. And so, that's how kind of the book developed in the way that it did. So I don't have advice because because I kind of came to this in a bumbling way. But it culminated in this, 7 years later, I'm holding, my book.
So good. I mean, I was struck reading your on methods section, I think is where you talk kind of about the journey, just briefly about the journey. I'm so glad I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about it, about the ways in which you and I actually have very similar experiences. And I think they might be more common than we think. In my conversations, I've had a lot, the book came out in August 2020. I've had a lot of conversations since then with people. And I keep finding people in the space who are like, I had no idea I was going to end up here. Like I wasn't planning for this to be the thing. And yet when I encountered some people, it changed my life. And I started asking some questions and here I am. And for me, it was very similar. I got my PhD in Brazilian and American poetry from the 1950s. So if anybody wants to talk about concretismo, I'm all in, but nobody ever asked me that. Like no one has ever followed up and asked me that question. But I have this whole life that has really very little to do with what I ended up pursuing as my career. And yet it all came together in kind of this beautiful sort of backwards way. And I think if we're speaking to an undergraduate audience, one of the things that I think is very important about what Heba and I are both talking about is there's kind of a flexibility in our careers of like, not this is the thing I've always planned on. The world is a really tumultuous place. Things are really shifting. The skills that I've learned in a variety of ways have helped me to be gainfully employed and actually to do work that I find much more meaningful than what I might have been doing if I had stuck with my actual plan. But for me, I just encountered Muna originally. I volunteered at a fall festival. My husband and I speak Spanish. We were translating healthcare pamphlets. We were like handing people some healthcare pamphlets for a friend who had said, do you want to come help? And I met all these people from Myanmar. And long story, very, very short, Muna needed weavers. She wanted English classes. I had taught ESL living in other countries. We began teaching English. We became close friends with this community. And after 7 years, we finished running a nonprofit that had helped these women, mostly women. There was one man, there was one tailor, he was wonderful. Sew and weave and make jewelry and make some income off of it, get a resume out of it, and then get jobs. And so our goal was, it was always a Band-Aid solution. I never had any sense that this was the thing I was going to do with my life. I got my PhD. I went on to become a Mellon Fellow at Southwestern University here in Austin. And the rhetoric shifted in Texas. Like all of a sudden, there was this massive, it just felt like a seismic shift, and people had always supported refugees. I mean, it had been like kind of it was like not controversial at all, almost to a fault. Like people weren't questioning things. And then all of a sudden, churches and mosques and synagogues found themselves kind of at the forefront of a conversation in which people were deeply racist and having all kinds of problematic conversations about what it meant to be a refugee. And so I just asked my friends, can I write your story? Does anybody need some help? I discovered quickly there was a unique place for someone who was friends with people in the community and could write using pseudonyms. And so I brought my issues of representation and all of the academic work and translation work that I had done in order to kind of develop these methods on the fly, start writing stories. Within like 3 months, Teen Vogue had called, and they were all like, had a tweet that went viral about what was happening during the Muslim travel ban, which was on Holocaust Remembrance Day. I mean, it was just this sense of outrage because it was affecting people that I loved. And that's how I moved into this work. So same as you, this is not the thing that I thought that I would end up doing. And yet my relationships compel me. And now I've developed, I think, kind of a methodology around bearing witness to what is happening and making sure that people don't forget these are real people. This is not just these are not policies. This is not something that's dry and stuffy. These affect real lives.
Mhm.
I want to move to a couple of questions that I immediately want to know from you. There are some things that you said in this book that I have been bumping up against and have not really understood in such a clear way. And so I want to talk about, there are a few differences in our book. One is that mine is focused only on US resettlement, and that was very intentional. I wanted this to be a book for the US about what was happening in the US. But it is incredibly important that we understand our place as global leaders, and we have this sense of ourselves as like, refugee resettlement is this kind of, medal that we pin to our jacket and feel so proud of. And yet you do, I think, an excellent job of comparing the US refugee resettlement system with the Canadian and the German resettlement systems, pointing out what is good about them and also some really essential criticisms that I had not really seen in such a clear way. And I think what you were saying about not being a policy person, I think it's clear you come to this from a place of real intellectual curiosity. Talk a little bit about like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of those three systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And people always ask me when I present this or when they read it, what's the best system? What's the best program? And I think that, the nature of sort of critiquing and comparing means that, you leave being like, well, there isn't a good answer to that question, right? And so I think that when we think about these systems and when we're thinking about the mechanisms and when we're thinking, and I think that something you said earlier is absolutely true. And that was the question that I had for you, which is how to tell human-centric stories, right? Which you do really beautifully. Is that when we talk about human beings sort of confronting and coming up against these, systems that far predate them, right? When we're talking about the German system, we're really talking about something, Bismarckian, right? We're talking about something that way predates people. That's a German system designed for Germans in order for, there to be clear and efficient employment systems, for there to be workers' rights, and also for there to be specialization. And so, the systems in and of themselves, are not necessarily pernicious in and of themselves, though I do think that they are exclusionary in different ways, which is the argument that I make in the book. But when we think about people and we think about human beings, what we really need to do is center their possibilities, right? And center their complexities. And so what I see is that in the United States, we unfortunately have an erosion of our welfare systems. We have an erosion of our social service systems. And despite the fact that, as you point out very clearly in After the Last Border, we have resettlement is truly humanitarian in its conceptualization, in the way that it should work. But unfortunately, there's a disjuncture that happens in the case of the United States between somebody being selected, as a humanitarian refugee on the basis of their need, right? Like Hasna and Munal were both selected, but then they get into the airplane. And upon arrival, they enter a system that's primarily structured to see them as burdens on the state and as potential workers in a system that's highly, highly unequal. And in that disjuncture, you have an integration into American poverty. I mean, when you describe Munal's first, experiences here of just not being able to find food, not having a sense of what that looks like, working for pittance, not having anybody to help her in English, right? These are real things that could be stopped by a policy intervention. And I think that's the benefit of the comparative angle, which is to say, when you talk to people in the United States and you say, well, you could offer more by way of integration support. We could be offering people a year when they arrive of assistance. We could be offering people English classes. People are like, yeah, but there's no political will for that. Like, that's kind of like a utopian, like that's idealistic. That's something that's not possible. And I'm like, well, just on the other side of the border in Canada, it is possible. And in Germany, it's even longer. And while those systems have their problems, right, they are able to address people's needs in different ways, and they're able to mitigate this experience of poverty in different ways. And so that's how I would answer that. And actually, I would love to ask you a question now, which is, something that really struck me and something that I tried to do, and I think that you did beautifully, is to center the human narrative, right? You have, in your stories, for instance, when Munal is having, like, when her marriage is on the rocks, or, when, Layla's relationship to Hasna and Layla's relationship to Melek, there's real complexities there of love, of loss, of complications that are also part of the resettlement story, but often get flattened because when we're talking about somebody and we label them capital R refugee, as a proper noun, what it almost reduces a lot of that into this idea that they've been displaced. And I wonder how you thought about that and how you approached it in your writing.
Yeah, such a great question. So there are a couple of things that I think are really important. First of all, it is a great grief to me that Muna and Hasna, which are not their real names, are never able to be a part of these conversations. And so that is my starting and ending place, that the goal of this book was for them to feel that their stories were told with integrity and with beauty, that it's not just as they're not stereotypes, they're real women. And I am deeply in relationship with both of them. I have been texting all morning with Hasna's family. These are not relationships that began and ended with the book, but they will be lifelong friendships. My children don't know actually that they're not related to Munal's kids. They're pretty sure that they're cousins. And so when we talk about this, for me, a human-centric story has to have one goal, which is to tell the story that the person wants to be told. And as you and I both know, in talking to people who are former refugees or who are displaced, that is a short-term visa category. No one ever asks me to tell the tourist experience. No one ever asks me to speak as a tourist on behalf of all tourists, even though, or an expatriate, even though I lived for 2 years in Brazil. No one has ever said to me, what was that experience like? Can you now speak to everyone? That was several years ago. And so we do this to refugees as if the journey across the desert or the journey in the boat or the walk in, across the border is the sum of their existence, because that's the story that we have been primed by Hollywood and by media portrayals and by other books to see as the refugee story. And so I intentionally worked against that stereotype in this book, in part because I knew that that was such a problem, and in part because this is not the story that the women were interested in telling. So I had been friends with Muna for over a decade by the time we started this process. She speaks English. It's a real detriment to me that I'm not able to speak the language. I am deeply indebted to a translator, an interpreter who uses the pseudonym Amina, who is Syrian, without whom this book could not have been written. The context, the flavors, there's so much of this is just the three of us together sitting around Hasna's table. And it basically started with, what do you want people to know? And I got the journey for Muna out of the way in the very beginning. So she crossed the border, she was a refugee, she was 5, that was it. And the rest of the book is what actually happened. For her, it's a story of coming to grips with her mom, her relationship with her husband, of understanding that she as a woman can stand on her own 2 feet. She wanted women to know in the story that they're strong and they can do anything. That was her goal. And Hasna's story is not about the war in Syria. It's about what happened in Daraa and her efforts to keep her family together. And so I could have written 7 books about Hasna with the information that I got from her. So much of the best parts of her story we had to leave out. There are some just really critical moments where her family was right there as the war was beginning, and we didn't include it because it would have revealed their identities. And so my goal in this was always to tell the story that was about her as a person, and to recognize that these are whole, complex, relational people who happened to be banned, or their children happened to be banned by the Muslim travel ban, not they're summed up by how we feel about them. For me, I think the real key part of this, I had several Syrian beta readers who read it, and one of them said she wished she could stay in the first chapter where Hasna's sitting in her courtyard with coffee and the war has not yet begun. And I think that's, we need to show what is lost as much as what happens after that fact, right? And I think it's one of the things that I think you do so beautifully in this, is describing these are many of the people you're writing were middle class people. They had full lives, they were employers, they were workers, and you talk a lot about the erasure of their experiences, and this kind of making them into human capital really erases their humanity. What was that like for you in doing a lot of those interviews, and kind of coming to how did you come to some of these ideas through these relationships?
Yeah, I think that something that you said earlier, like telling the story that people want told, and listening, truly hearing what people are saying. So we have these tropes, and you actually see it in the medical profession all the time. So a lot of time I was interpreting for people who, needed to get access to healthcare, mental health care, or physical health care. And there's a tendency for the diagnostic to sort of reduce folks, right? So if you're a refugee, you must have PTSD. If you come exhibiting certain symptoms, you must have X. And I think that our role as sort of critical thinkers and social scientists broadly construed outside of its academic, strict definition, right? People who study the social world,
Right.
To listen to the complexities of the stories that people are telling you, to have a sensibility when somebody is expressing a certain sense of dignity, is introducing themselves, to have a sense of how people spend their leisure time, right? Not just how people experience adversity. And this is something that I tell my students all the time. And I tell folks who are just starting out in ethnography, just starting out and telling human-centric stories, which is to say, don't just focus on when things are happening, focus on what's not happening, focus on when people are just like chilling in their house, and, what they say to their kids and what they watch on television. Because that really tells you how a person sort of sees themselves. And if we really take people as sort of complicated, full people, as people going through divorces, as people with, fraught relationships with their mothers, as children who aren't doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing at any given time, then we're able to see, a more complex and complete picture of what it means to be displaced, of traumas that continue to unfold, of of the human and emotional nature of trauma, right? Of losing something that you had. So there's nothing inherently wrong with working, any kind of job, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with being a stranger, but that the feelings that are, experienced as people are having these moments of disjuncture, these moments of newness, the infrastructure that surrounds them, the hostility, right? And we're talking about, and I think you do this beautifully as well, because you're brought to this book with the travel ban, with the Trump administration, with this hostility. And I think that something you said earlier, and for the younger folks who might be listening to us, resettlement was not controversial at all. It was actually done through churches. It was done through churches. It was like the most conservative people, right? Who actually were supporting resettlement. When we're in this moment where the world is just turned upside down around these people, I think that reminding people and seeing people as complicated is really, really important. And I think that, and the other thing I want to add is that it's also, even in the best of times, resettlement has this really harsh security framework, right? Our immigration system has a really harsh security framework. But what does it mean when, and as you said before, nobody's asked you to speak on behalf of all tourists, right? What does it mean that even when we advocate for refugees, we say, well, no refugee has ever committed an act of terror. And it's like, well, if one had, does that mean all the rest would as well? What is this category that we've created, right? And like, I would love you to also speak on that, on the naming that we do, and on the categorization we do, and how we break out of that.
I mean, we're going to have to move into race, because there's no way that we can talk about the history of refugee resettlement, especially I don't say especially in the United States, I'm going to say in Canada and Germany as well, without talking about the complex history around race. No one has ever said to me as a white woman, or to my husband as a white man, you need to speak on behalf of all white people and prove that you're not a terrorist. I swear to you, I don't have the numbers, but I promise this is something that I will stake my life on. More acts of terrorism were committed by white men in the last year, or the last decade, or the last 100 years than were ever happened because a refugee came into the United States. It's the dumbest system if you're a terrorist to try to come through, because the vetting process is so ridiculous. So what makes me so frustrated, obviously, because I get kind of, riled up about this, I don't like the arguments that we use about people that they're safe. I don't like the arguments that we use about people that they are going to be good workers. We continue to have these. I understand why refugee resettlement agencies are forced to do this. I know that this is a complex thing for them. And yet I don't ever want us to lose track of the fact that we continue to often make the case on behalf of entire groups of people that they are deserving, that they are not like those other immigrants. In fact, the book that I'm working on right now, it's called We Were Illegal, is really working with some of the stereotypes that often start with immigration and refugee resettlement, and looking at my own family and saying, oh yeah, no, we actually were illegal immigrants. We actually were the terrorists. We actually were the people who were doing these things, instigating these acts of violence, and recognizing the way that our national stories about groups of people inform our opinions, which inform our policies, right? Talk a little bit about, I think you just did I love the W.B. Du Bois. I like some of the sections in which you talk about the racialized systems, the social systems, the public discourse, some of these ideas into which refugees walk with really no idea of what's happening, and they haven't done anything, and yet they kind of walk into these systems that are already stacked against them.
Yeah, so the thing, about race, and race is primarily an inequality, right? And it is socially constructed but real in its consequences. Folks
I love that.
Taking a sociology class probably might have heard that. But what that means is that when you arrive to this country, you don't arrive Black or white or Arab or any of these things. You arrive as a person, and you figure out very quickly where you fit within the racial structure of this country. So, when we talk about race, we're talking about race as a master status, which means that it's one of the first things we think about people when we see them. If I'm describing Jessica, I'm going to say she's a white woman. And that's immediate, that's the way that we categorize people. That's how we think about people in this country. And that's something we're taught. It's not something that's natural. And so what that ends up meaning is that that's the same, that's how we categorize people, but that's also that racism and inequality is also embedded in our systems, right? When you take, for instance, a critical race theory approach, what that's saying is that, you know, the laws might say one thing, the laws might say refugees welcome, right? But when, or you know, we help low income people through a welfare policy that's colorblind, but in actual practice, right, our welfare system in this country was defunded due to anti-Black racism and also anti-immigrant racism. And this is something that, you know, is captured in your book, Jessica, because you have the transformation of the welfare policies in 1996 to exclude immigrants, and also reshapes resettlement policy because, you know, you have temporary assistance for needy families, which has lifetime limits, very short in duration. And therefore people really struggle when they arrive under this system. So when we think about how race matters, and I'm focusing on the United States, but I could tell a similar story in Canada, where a policy of multiculturalism, despite the fact that it's, you know, been touted as a you know, a vehicle for inclusion, also excludes Indigenous people, creates a sense where people need to experience gratitude, and where there ceases to be language about talking about racism. And in Germany, you know, through the year 2000, Germany described itself as, its immigration policy was explicitly, we are not a country of immigration. And you had to, in order to become a citizen in Germany, you had to have German blood. And so across these countries and across the world, we have notions of who is included, who belongs and who doesn't belong. And those imprint all of the systems in the country that receive people. And people really, when they arrive, have to figure out not only how to navigate another country, but also how to navigate another country in the context of all of these systems that are structured to sort of not see them, right, as full people. But something I wanted you to talk about, and this is something so I look at people in their very first initial 3 years. I really look at how they're received in the country of refuge. But you, and particularly in the case of Muna, because you had the long relationship with her, were able to tell a longer story about her. And I wonder what your reflections are about, you know, and to use maybe academic terms, but also it's something that really struck me here is the way that you toggle and the way that you write about structure and agency, right? What are the systems that are receiving people, but also how people resist in all these various ways. I mean, even the purchase of her cake and chips, right, is a resistance. Right? That was it was a beautiful testament to her agency as a person, that she left and she fed her family, even, you know, at its basic level. So I wonder how you sort of think about, you know, the toggling between sort of structure and agency in the story that you're telling.
I love that. And I'm gonna get to that, but I also want to talk about, there's a part of your book, I'm going to quote you back to you, and then I'll answer the question. And because I want to bring into this some ideas of gender as well. So you have on page 10 in this, by traveling to the West, the assumption goes, women escape the jaws of patriarchy. But belying this racist assumption are the realities of diversity among the world's 3 billion Muslims and 5 million Arabs, and of inequalities embedded in the institutions of destination countries that often fail to protect women's labor and time. And for me, I think, because I told the story of 2 women, because I set out to tell the story of women as opposed to men, because I often walk into situations in which the men, who usually have better language skills, often speak on behalf of the group. Part of what I wanted to tell was the story of what it was like for people who were not the soldiers. There are many accounts of soldiers. I was really kind of aware of the gaps in this literature. There are so many stories that are written by former refugees and should be written. I have no place in any of that process. There was a tiny, tiny place where these were 2 women whose stories were immediate. This was not something that happened 20 years ago that their daughters can then share. This was something that was happening currently, needed to be told currently, but their identities needed to be protected. So these felt like, in some ways, the way that we think in kind of these big systems, very small stories. And yet within those small stories, they're extraordinary. And I know that because I know these women, right? And so I wanted to tell a story. One of my favorite books by Svetlana Alexievich, she talks about the unwomanly face of war. And she says, when you talk to women about war, they always talk about shoes and spoons. And I laughed. I read it after I turned in a manuscript and thought, that's exactly right. The very first thing that Muna talked about were her shoes. And it's not to say that women love shoes. I do love good shoes, but it is to say the so often in gendered cultures, women are tasked with making sure that everyone's eating, that everyone is clothed, that kind of that mental load and the emotional labor that we often are now talking about in middle class, white collar US sectors. That mental load is borne by women in war. And so for me, I wanted to tell the story, not of the war. The war is the backdrop of this. It's the thing that happened kind of outside of that. I wanted to ask these women, and I'm always really clear to say, this is not the story. This is not my interpretation of their story. This is what they wanted people to understand. So I when I say carefully, I spent 2 years, meaning every 2 weeks, I have thousands of pages of transcripts. This was a wildly deep dive into the lives of these women, because I wanted to be so very careful in bringing the details of their lives. And I asked them a lot of questions. Mudak, because she knows me and we kind of are funny friends with each other, she would get to the point where she was like, okay, yes, okay, so I walked into my house. You remember that my couch was here. This is what it looked like. Here was the lamp. It leaned to the left. I could smell the smell. There was dust on the place because I had forgotten to dust that day. Like those kinds of visceral details that all of us notice and don't always recall. I asked them so many questions. I knew I had found the right person in Hasna when she spent an hour and a half telling me about the plants in her courtyard. I was like, this is what I want. I want someone who really wants to describe exactly what happened and what was lost. And I think my goal in this was to really bring people so fully into the journey that they forgot that they were refugees and were just thinking about what was happening with Munar, thinking about what was happening with Hasna. That for me is the real heart of Human Centric, is it's that kind of deep focus on one person, but also two people, but also recognizing, you know, the dangers of a single story, which is something that we always need to keep present. These are not people speaking on behalf of all refugees. They're just two people. I want to keep an eye on our time, and I'm going to say that I would love for us to, if you have a question that you want to enter the chat, go ahead and enter it into the chat, and we'll start moving towards a Q&A in a few minutes. But I want to talk just a minute, and I want to use what I said just a second ago about the kind of racialized assumptions that we have in the West about what it means to be a refugee. I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about Ukraine. I know you and I both have some discomfort with that. I've also, I think, been really heartened by the response that I'm seeing across social media, on TikTok, on Instagram, by people who are really calling out the coverage of what's happening in Ukraine versus what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Ethiopia, what's happening in Myanmar or in Syria. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. And I want to say, before I get to that, something that you said really struck me, and this is something I wrote in the margins of the book, which is that, you know, when we are talking about feminism and we're talking about feminist resistance, we have this understanding of just like a radical, like gun-toting woman who's like on the front line or something like that. But often feminism and feminist resistance looks like everyday, you know, struggle to keep your family fed, to keep your family safe, and to advocate in a very meaningful way. So when, for instance, Munal goes to talk to, you know, the property manager, right? That is how we sort of can think about everyday feminist resistance. And I think that recognizing and telling these complicated stories that center women are a very radical feminist act, because of these images that we get, you know, and this is a perfect segue into the question you asked about Ukraine, because, you know, that's also a part of the story there, right? That we're seeing these, you know, this resistance, that we're focusing on the resistance, that the resistance is celebrated globally, despite the fact that resistance in other places in the world is often dismissed as terrorism, or as, you know, coming out of Syria, if you had held a gun, you know, you were disqualified. It is a disqualifying factor for resettlement to have participated in resistance. Which is a huge, you know, it's a huge issue. It's who is celebrated for acts of resistance and who is not. But the thing about Ukraine, and I have written about this recently, and I hope to write more about this, which is to say that, you know, when we look at Ukraine, we're seeing a tragedy. We're seeing people fleeing a Russian invasion. We're seeing 4 million people flee. And even if those people do end up going back to Ukraine, they've lost things that they're never going to regain, right? Because they've had this trauma, they've had this moment of disjuncture that, you know, Muna has had, that Hasna has had, that the men and women in my book have had. And it's truly a horrifying thing. And the thing is, though, that when they approach borders, the same sets of borders that, Layla, for instance, approached in your book, that the people who I spoke to in Greece this summer approached, the borders of the European Union, but also the borders of the United States. Their experience of borders and bordering and the systems that we have in place is radically different, right? Biden came out and said, we're going to admit 100,000 Ukrainians into this country. Meanwhile, there are 6 million Syrians who continue to be displaced. There are Eritreans who have been suffering decades-long wars. There are people who are currently in refugee camps in Greece and in situations of protracted displacement, refugee camps in Libya, and refugee camps all throughout, the world, who are just waiting for their reprieve, and a reprieve that isn't coming, particularly because our resettlement program in the United States, as it currently stands, has been decimated. I was talking to a journalist last week, and so I pulled up the numbers. We've committed to resettling 125,000 people. We've only admitted 8,000, and that's in this fiscal year, which is ending as of September. And so, how are we going to admit the remaining 15,000 that we said we were going to admit? And so, what we're seeing right now is that Ukrainians, the welcome that they're receiving, the support that they're receiving is wonderful, and it should not be begrudged to them. But the question is, why isn't everybody else being received? And another example is the U.S. southern border, which is Title 42, right? Which was a policy that made it so that folks could not seek asylum at our southern border. And, last year there were months in which 200,000 people were pushed back every single month at that border. And, when Ukrainians began to appear at our southern border, the Biden administration told CBP, told Customs and Border Patrol, to use their discretion when it came to Ukrainians. And so they were standing alongside people who have been waiting for years just to apply for asylum, which is an internationally sanctioned right, and they've been denied. So when I'm asked to speak about the double standard, what I say is that what we're seeing is an exception to the rule, that these systems have long been structured to keep folks out, have long been structured to deny people refuge, have long been decimated in the United States. For instance, the resettlement system for the last 6 years now has been decimated. And what we're seeing is Ukrainians being exception to the rules because, due to the same racist systems that we've been talking about before, they're recognized as humans, whereas other folks are denied that same recognition. And so it's a real, it's a really sad situation when we use the framework of securitization, when we use the framework of sort of a resource threat for everybody else, and when we really become not a safe haven for those folks who are fleeing from other countries. It's a real tragedy, and it's a real racist tragedy.
I think part of the thing, the thing I said earlier that surprised me, that it was not about policy. Policy was not the sort of objective thing that happened in a vacuum, but the way that we feel about people is their ticket in. And it's so surreal to be watching this in real time. So those of us who were connected with refugee resettlement got really swept up in what they're calling the digital Dunkirk. I don't love that phrase, but what happened in Afghanistan with the fall of Kabul. You talk to anyone who has known any refugees. I had very few experiences with people from Afghanistan, just a handful of friends, and suddenly I was pulled deeply into that process, interviewing people and connecting people. At one point, my husband came in and he was like, "Are you in a spy ring? Like, what is happening here?" Because it was like a woman at a base in Germany that was getting information that I was giving to people, they were giving to people in Afghanistan. It was such a systemic failure. And it was something that really caught our attention. And I just heard people say, never again, never again. It was what, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, right? And so understanding that our reactive attention span is actually the thing that is the prompter for so much of our policies allows us, I think, to step back and think critically about whether this actually is the best policy, or if there are some other things that we might be doing that could be done better. I see some chats coming in. So do we want to just kind of read this a little bit? I'll read this one, Heba, and let you answer it.
Sure.
So Michael's saying he wants to appreciate the work that we're doing. Thank you. So his question ties into how can we improve the current legal system to better address violent crimes committed by refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers and keep American citizens safe? Heba, you want to jump in with that one?
Sure. I'm not sure what violent crimes you're referring to, because actually in the history of refugee resettlement, we have not had violent crimes committed. But the point to make is that if we believe that, like you, Michael, you said you come from an immigrant family. We believe that we are all sort of people who come from different walks of life, right? And I don't believe, Michael, that you are more likely to commit a crime than I am. I don't believe that anyone is more likely to commit a crime than anyone else by virtue of being a refugee, being an immigrant, being a citizen or not, right? If we believe in the full complexity of human beings, then we can't start from a place of assuming that they're dangerous, right? And it's an assumption that's really unfounded and honestly based on sort of, racist tropes of that people who are different from me are going to have different values than me, are going to have different expectations, are going to pose different threats, which is actually unsubstantiated, right? We don't see evidence of that. We don't see evidence that any one group of people is more likely to commit crimes, is more likely to be violent than any other group of people. What we do see is that the structures with which we receive people, how we treat people, shapes their place in society, right? And creates systemic inequalities and creates these divisions and can be the true violence that we want to avoid. So I don't know that, we need laws to protect against threats that don't really exist. And I think that, unfortunately, this idea of threat has been politicized, where we're seeing an erosion in our immigration systems, in our refugee systems, which we are committed to, we have committed to, historically with UN, with the United Nations Convention for Refugees, and also with our commitment to not send people back, our commitment to allow people to seek asylum, which is an international right. And so we're basically eroding our commitments. We're denying our commitments because we politicized and criminalized a group of people who are just as human as me or you. Jessica, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
I mean, I will just quibble with one thing that you said, and I think it is fair to say that the group of people that has committed the most violence in the 200 plus years of 250 years almost of US being a country, much less the 400, 500 years. I'm not great at history math in this exact moment. So however long it's been since white people stepped foot on this continent, it is white people who have done this violence. And again, I'm writing a book right now about my own family's immigration to Texas. I'm currently working on a chapter about a feud that happened in 1899 that was a result of the Reconstruction and then the deconstruction of the Reconstruction, which took 40 years. And I find so many parallels to our current moment, I cannot keep up. There was this way in which no one was ever convicted for the dozens of murders that occurred, most of them of Black bodies, in this one county, which is just a microcosm of what happens around the country. And I think both of us are kind of reframing that question a bit. I would often ask, what is it that we can do to keep immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers safe from the many people who threaten them? So the two women I write about alone, much less the dozens of people I'm friends with here, have faced such vitriol in such just really horrific situations. They've been physically assaulted, they have been spit upon, there was a knife attack that happened to some of my friends. So there are so many acts of violence that happen. The other thing I would say, just to kind of broaden it out a little bit, we deeply need reformation of the entire immigration system. So part of what we often do is have these narratives in our head of who is allowed to have this thing, who is allowed to have this thing. So refugees are here and we need to, in order to, give them the grant of this wonderful thing that we are offering, resettlement, they need to be deserving, they need to kind of meet these categories. And if you do not meet this very, very tiny, tight-knit group, then you're unable to come to the United States through legal systems. One of my closest friends came in the 1980s their family was able to get amnesty under Reagan, but their sister, who was still in Monterrey, Mexico, decided to enter the country legally last week. So 20 plus years later, she was finally able to get her visa. That is nuts. And so we need to understand that the problem does not lie with individuals who are coming over, but with a system that is so problematic that families cannot be reunited for 20 years, even if they're doing everything right.
I also, can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
When we think about who is an immigrant, we think about who is a refugee, particularly when we're thinking about the US-Mexico border. I highly, highly urge, the listeners to go look at the history of that border and to think about what defines who is an immigrant, who is included in the nation and who is not, right? Mexican American activists famously say, we did not cross the border crossed us.
Yep.
And I just spoke to I was just in Tijuana doing some interviews, and one of the women who I spoke to, who is an American, who is, has lived her whole life on the border. Her great grandmother was born in Los Angeles, Mexico. Right. And so when we're thinking about what constitutes, what defines who is here and who is not here, these are really arbitrary distinctions, often shaped by histories of negotiation of where political boundaries lie. And so when we're thinking about these things, we really have to think about the social construction of who is and is not a part of our, citizenry and our populace.
That's good. Wing Kai asked this question: if we can comment on the current state of Syrian and Burmese immigrant communities and their relationship with their homeland in their diasporas. I thought especially the section like here and there, that you talked about, that the pull of people who have family members. I think I've often said this is the cruelest part of being a resettled refugee, is that you are safe while your loved ones are not. And it is a drain financially. It is an emotional. It is just such a painful thing emotionally. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that you also, in terms of Hassan's relationship with Layla, for instance, who gets out later, those kinds of connections, we're in a global system where we have really failed people. So globally, we have 1 in every 95 people is displaced. The vast majority are displaced within their countries. So like, to cities nearby or to villages nearby, the one that they're from. About half of those are displaced outside of their countries, a little less than half, to countries nearby. So that would be Jordan, for instance, Lebanon, Turkey in the case of Syrians. So about 83% of the world's displaced people are displaced immediately proximate to their country of origin. And very, very few make it to countries of resettlement or asylum. They're not reasonable expectations for people because they're expensive to get to. And resettlement is a program that only selects, 100,000 people every year in the best of times in the United States, which so in a sense, globally, out of the 20 to 30 countries that offer resettlement any given year, about 1% of the world's refugees are ever sort of offered resettlement. So what that means is that when you arrive to a country like the United States or Canada or Germany, which were the 3 I discussed, you become a lifeline in a very meaningful way for, all these people that the world has just forgotten, right? People who are stuck in protracted situations of protracted displacement in refugee camps, people who are stuck in their countries of origin but displaced. And you can really be, and that's what I explore in that chapter, can be the difference in life and death, right? If somebody, I've had people in my who I've known who, their father had a stroke in Syria, and and medical care requires money, and they're trying to get the money in order to be able to offer their father medical care. In another case, you had a young man who was going to join a militia, not because he wanted to join a militia, but because they pay, and his family was starving to death. And, because his sister was able to send a couple $100s back home, was she able to prevent that outcome, for the time being. You also have the question of legal pathways, right? In the United States, our main structure for immigration is family resettlement, is family sponsorship. And so what you end up having is that people who arrive here who are able to become citizens, which is very complicated for the reasons that Jessica also describes in her book, right? Which is that you don't actually get a chance to learn English when you first arrive. You're kind of, stuck in this situation where you're experiencing a lot of trauma and you're trying to make a living. People aren't able to take the citizenship exam, when they qualify for it. And therefore, they're not able to sponsor their families to arrive and join them in the United States. So there's a real burden and difficulty in being a refugee, being the person who got out, being the person who got to travel, and an expectation and a desire to help all of the people who you love, who are still stuck in those situations of protracted displacement. I mean, talk about survivor's guilt. there's a real emotional ramification to this as well as remaining connected. And Jessica, I'm sure that I know that there were smatterings of this also in your book, with the relationship between Hasna and Layla, with Muna as well. And I'm really wondering what you saw when it came to that kind of connection. You're muted.
If I unmute myself, it'll be better. I saw this briefly, and then I have one quick last question that I want to hear from you, and then we'll move to Janet. I want to make sure we give Janet time. For me, one of the things people often ask in book events is, where are Muna and Hasna now? And the answer really speaks to this. So Muna is in a situation where one of her daughters got in a wreck and they didn't understand the system, and the fine that would have been a few $100s is now compounded to $10,000, and they're not able to pay for it. So those of us who love them are trying to figure out how to contribute to them in a way that still respects their dignity. She is one of the most stubborn women I know in the best possible way, and doesn't want charity, and I absolutely understand that. And as we explained the other day, because my parents had wealth from their parents. My grandfather was an oil person. I mean, they weren't rich, but they had enough. And when they had student loans, the grandparents could pay for it. And there were times when I needed my parents to kind of help me. And we have this system that we don't even think about, in which when something happens, there's a safety net of my family or of my community that would help. Refugees don't have that. They are their only safety net, and they're the global safety net for the people in their lives as well. So the hooks onto them are so many, and there's nothing kind of keeping them rooted here. And so for me, I think the onus is on those of us who are in relationship with former refugees. They are not currently refugees. Muna is a citizen. Hasna will be a citizen soon. The onus is on us, I think, to not take the place of family, but to also view this as relational work. So my goal in this always has been, the book is the smallest part of what we're doing. I wanted to listen for them to feel heard. And I also wanted to make sure that we were that we're finding ways to connect them to the community, and that I'm interested and able to be a part of that community, whatever that looks like for the community, right? And so that was really my last question for you, is what has that looked like for you on a personal level? So we've talked a lot about policy, and we've talked a lot about kind of this big picture stuff, but I know you have relationships with these people. So what does this look like for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, similarly to what you were saying, Jessica, right? Like these are my friends. I am regularly in contact with them. I also, like, as I was doing this work, I was a graduate student. I didn't have much money myself, but I did have capital, right? When we think about, how you come to this moment, this book writing moment, right? It means that I've had tremendous privileges in my life that have brought me to this book writing moment. And folks have had tremendous trauma in their life, which is what brought them to the moment of sort of, being in the United States and having that interaction. And so I feel that, the capitals that we carry, which aren't necessarily cash, right? They can be, your ability to advocate, my knowledge of the languages, my understanding of, the framework for social services in the United States. I tried to use that and leverage it to the best of my ability. I organized marches, I wrote whenever I could. And then most recently, after the book was done, being written and was in its process of publication, I began a citizenship clinic, which is a BU, has now become a Boston University project, which is bringing together my BU students who are learning the languages that people speak. So in this case, Arabic, and the people who are in my project, but also people who they know and friends that they have across the country, to study for the citizenship exam. As somebody who grew up as an immigrant here, I know that, I've had, aunties and uncles, fake aunties and uncles, not real, because we came here, we didn't come here with any relatives, who, despite not speaking very good English, were able to pass the citizenship exam because it's a rote learning story, right? You just have to be able to pass it. So through this tutoring project, which really makes it where everybody's learners, right? My students are learners, and the refugees are learners as well, or the former refugees are learners as well. It creates a space where we have this like mutual learning, mutual student environment where people don't feel patronized or talked down to. And we've had 8 people pass the citizenship exam as a result of this project. So I'm really proud of that. And that's sort of one way that I try to impact my environment. But I think that's something that academics particularly need to think about and need to sort of reckon with, which is that, when we tell people stories, there's something we're taking, right? We're taking their time, we're taking their energy,
Right.
and we write under our own names, and we have to use pseudonyms because because the world remains unsafe for them. And so the question that I'm always asking myself, and that I know you're always asking yourself as well, is, what can I do to leave a positive impact? How is this really reshaping the world, reshaping the conversation, but also benefiting the people who have given me their time and energy and emotions, in order for me to be able to write this and say something about, the displaced and the experience of people who are displaced.
So good. Have you had, I'm going to just quickly say this and then I'm going to turn it over to Janet. Rachel's asking an important question, and I'll summarize it by saying, have you had people change their minds as a result of your work or reading this book?
Well, my book is just out, so I want you to answer that, because
I'm going to say it quickly. And I'm also going to say this was just an incredible conversation. What a mark of a good conversation that I want to talk for another hour. So I hope that we continue to keep this going. You can find Heba and I both on Twitter. And I think that was probably the best place for both of us to just kind of have this conversation. I had the best conversation with my neighbor 2 doors down. And she came in and she was like, this book, I had no idea about the systems. I had no idea that I benefited from these systems. She's a white woman in her 80s. And for me, that was the pinnacle of this. I wanted to show that this was not just a story about those kinds of people, but a story about us in a collective way that is not just, all of us who are in the United States, that we're bound in this together, and that those of us who do come from positions of privilege need to recognize this. Janet, I'm going to turn it over to you. Heba, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This was lovely. And Janet, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, I feel overwhelmed. That's the first thing I want to say. This has been a brilliant discussion by 2 brilliant women. Good thing we educate girls regarding 2 brilliant books. And I guess I want to start with methodology, because you've talked about how you cannot use the names of the people you interview. This is not where I intended to start, but I've written quite a few books based on interviews with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, immigrant women, minority women, religious minority women such as Mennonites. And currently the book that Wayne Kai mentioned kindly, Refugees in the Canadian Mosaic, and one that's at the publisher called, what is it called? People of Peace, the Doukhobor Search for Freedom and Justice in Canada. All of those books rely on interviews with people in Canada, and who, including refugees. The Doukhobors were refugees in 1899 to 1903 from Russia, of all places. They were pacifists sponsored by Leo Tolstoy, the author, who was a pacifist. So what I do is I never use their names in the book. Each group has its own chapters so that it has integrity of analysis. And I, with permission, put the respondents, the interviewees, whatever you want to call them, in the front of the book in the acknowledgements. Every single person that I interview, with Inuit, it was over 130. Usually I interview 30 to 50 people in a community. All their names are listed, but not as interviewees, but as consultants to the project or participants in the project. So when I refer to them in their chapter, it might be a woman in her middle 40s or a man who is approaching 90, or a 100-year-old woman. So you understand their gender and their age. You talked about a white woman in her 80s. That's me too. We do rely on some demographic characteristics to help identify each other. And people, I've only had one woman in the Doukhobor book, which was over 100 interviews, 130, decline to give her name, one. And people really appreciate that, because it by doing it this way, putting their names in the acknowledgements, and what it does is truly acknowledge and give them credit for their participation And it underscores the fact that this is their story. These are their stories. And to make sure that I get the stories right, I also, when I interview people, ask every person, would you be willing to read a draft of the chapter? And not everyone agrees to do that, but there's always enough, usually elder, but some middle-aged people too, people who say yes. And so when I finish the draft, I send the chapters to the consultants and they give me feedback. Now, I go to communities over and over. I develop a relationship with the participants as you do. And so sometimes I'm sitting down with them and talking about the changes. Sometimes it's by telephone, sometimes it's by email, but we negotiate any differences in analysis. And the last thing I do, I call it, and have written about it, I call it the progressive verification method. So even in the middle, at the end of an interview, I allow 15 minutes and ask the participants, I do a lot of focus groups as well as individual interviews, think back on our discussion. What is it you take away? If you were in a position of analyzing what you just said as a group or as an individual, what do you take out of that? What's the important point? And so the participants, the respondents actually are able to participate in the analytical interpretation of the data. And that has been absolutely fabulous for me. And it helps me make sure I do get the stories right. So I just wanted to throw that out. And I'm happy to send you anything that you'd like for just, formal documentation. The second thing I want to comment on was the concept of complex trauma linked with embedded racism, the fact that refugees come to a new country carrying the baggage that we all carried in, to our daily lives in any setting. And then they encounter a place that they don't know, and it's full of more trauma. The Canadian government has had a very stressful time. By the way, I was born and raised in Canada. I'm an immigrant to the US. I was 16 and I've been here 64 years, so do the math. The Canadian government has also agreed to take huge numbers, thousands and thousands of Ukrainians. But there's a couple of reasons for that. Like the US, there are many Ukrainians in Canada. It's the second largest diaspora of Ukrainians in the world after Russia. And the Ukrainians have gathered together not only to influence the government, but to work with the minister. She's, what is she, Deputy Prime Minister, who happens to be of Ukrainian heritage, which helps to make sure that the acceptance and the process of vetting people goes smoothly. So what happened was Canada, and this is recent news. I was just there 2 weeks ago for the first time in 2.5 years to see my family and do some interviews with the resettlement agencies. And in fact, the director of the Ontario Network of Private Sponsorship. So what happened was initially Canada said, we are not going to treat the Ukrainians as refugees. And this goes back to who's a good newcomer, who's a questionable newcomer. Well, of course, because of the base in Canada, because they're white, because they're educated, they come from a hard-won democracy, etc. Everybody said, oh, let them in, let them in. A lot of positive public response. And so what that meant was that as refugees, not being refugees, they were going to be defined as displaced persons under the old displaced persons legislation, which is also true in the US. They would not have access to resettlement agencies, which means that they would not have access to free English as a second language classes or French. And if they go to Quebec, which is unlikely. And so there was a public uproar. talking about receptivity and why we have all these rules about, security checks. And I was shocked at how many times some of the people you two wrote about were interviewed at different ways by different people. Oh my gosh, I would want to throw something at them eventually. Forget it. I don't want to come to your country. So there was an uproar and a lot of public discussion and editorials and so forth. And the Canadian government changed its mind 2 weeks ago and said, all right, they're still coming in as displaced refugees, but we're going to give them access to the resettlement agencies, limited, but guidance and information, and to ESL, free ESL programs. So I interviewed people at the resettlement agency that I work with a lot in London, Ontario, which has a huge Syrian community, by the way, that I interviewed Syrians and Kurds for my book Mosaic there. The resettlement manager and director said, this is so much better because some of the people who were resisting having them come in as refugees were okay with kind of a little different system because they realize these refugees, like others, will need it. So the biggest difference is if you're admitted as a refugee in Canada, you have 12 months of financial support. And it's pretty generous because you also get a baby bonus, the baby bonus, which has been in place since the 40s, per child every month. And that means you might end up, if you have 4 or 5 kids, an extra $2,000 per month on top of your refugee resettlement funding. And that's for 12 months. In the States, it's 4 to 6 months, depending on where you are. And so by having them called displaced persons, that meant that the government did not have to support them at that level. So what's happening is this is going to be private sponsorship with a government cushion. You had written about the difference between private sponsorship, government sponsorship, and blended sponsorship, which is a combination of the two. This is a new animal, which is private sponsorship with a little government support to make it work by giving access to resettlement. So there are many models of how to admit and support people who come from another country in the midst of trauma and anxiety and persecution and war and so forth. This one will probably become, oddly enough, the new model for how Canada accepts refugees. And that's the talk. So the other thing I wanted to say, Heba, you mentioned embedded racism. And you mentioned that was in the Multicultural Act, that Indigenous people, for example, like the Inuit, about whom I've written also, were not included, First Nations people. Well, that's because everything flows in the Multicultural Act, in the Refugee Act. Everything flows in Canada from its constitution, which was first written in 1867. It's a young country. That's when it became a country. And it was updated in 1982 to give equal rights to every single person, race, color, creed, First Nations, Indigenous, women. Our rights as, I'm a dual citizen, our rights as Canadians are embedded in the Canadian Constitution of 1982. Wasn't there first in 1867. We couldn't in the United States pass the Equal Rights Amendment. So our rights have to be pieced together from several bits of legislation and legal challenges. But in Canada, that's all in the Constitution. So everything else flows from that. And what I've done, I want to share a screen with a document, which I hope will be here somewhere. Let me know if you cannot see it. Can everyone see this government
It's not open fully, so yeah, now we can.
You can see it. Okay, so let me just go to a larger print for you. Heba, you mentioned in your book, which was fabulous, the government investment is so critical to what happens to newcomers. Oh, and by the way, one little note is when refugees arrive on Canadian soil, the minute they step off the plane and they're into the terminal, they are now called newcomers. And they instantly have all the rights and privileges of Canadian citizenship. That is to say, they are protected under the Constitution and all these other things that I'm going to show you. So I've given you in footnotes the sources of these things. So here's the Canadian Constitution. The Official Languages Act protects, although English and French are official languages, everything that's in government has to be done in both languages. If you have been to Canada, you know, in certain areas like Quebec and parts of, and all of Ontario, which are border provinces, has all the signs on the highways have to be done in both in French and English. But even though they established these two official language, neither language can be construed to take away from the rights or privileges of any other language. So for example, the Inuit language, Inuktitut, is preserved, it's protected under the Citizenship Act. I mean, the Official Languages Act. French is protected. And I wanted to link that to why do we have all these security things and go back to the Ukrainians too. Unfortunately, there is racism, there is sexism, ethnocentrism, et cetera, in every society. And in order to get positive refugee policies and practices, every country that does accept refugees has to give something to the right wing that doesn't want refugees. People don't want strangers, so you do that. The Languages Act in Canada, making French also the official language, and by the way, in the US, it's English only, is to get them on board so they wouldn't separate from Canada, because they wanted to separate very badly in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So saying, okay, your language is officially the language of Canada, helped keep the Francophone, the Quebecois, into the Canadian family. And of course, the two streams of English and French are the original dominant streams that were there for centuries before in Confederation, before the Constitution in 1867. They were there for like from the 1400s and the 1500s. So everybody else who comes in later is going to be, well, you're not one of us, okay? So then you have the Citizenship Act, which says everybody in Canada, whether you're there by birth or by choice, as in a refugee or an immigrant, enjoys equal status, same rights. Then the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1985. Every individual has equal opportunity. And then you have the Multicultural Act is the next major piece of legislation that's relevant to our discussion. Full participation, including social and economic, of individuals of all origins and their communities, and in promoting respect and appreciation for the multicultural reality. It has changed from white, Scottish, English, or French people that dominated the scene until the mid 1800s. It has changed, and that is threatening to some people. But more to the point, the last bullet, to encourage the preservation, enhancement, and sharing and evolving expression of multicultural heritage of Canada. And the last point, to provide support to anybody who wants to preserve or enhance or promote multiculturalism in Canada, so that the Native people are included in the Multicultural because it's a descendant and includes the constitutional requirements under law. So the last point is interesting because there used to be a Ministry of Multicultural. Now it's been integrated into another ministry in the government. But you can, if you're, let's say you're the Ukrainians, I've been there in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, when I was interviewing Ukrainian women 20 years ago for Keepers of the Culture, a different book on gender relations in different groups. You can apply to the multicultural people in Ottawa, the government headquarters, to get, a $10,000 grant to have a Ukrainian festival on a special day. If you are First Nations, let's say Métis, living up in the Northwest Territories, you can apply for a grant to have a sewing workshop to feature your special kind of handiwork. So any cultural, native, religious, anybody can apply for these things because Canada wants to celebrate the richness and the diversity. And
Janet,
yeah,
sorry to stop you here. Because we're getting close to the end, so we could stop sharing screen
okay.
so we can have a concluding thought.
Okay, so I wanted to say a few other things, but I think it's important to admit that in spite of all these structural and legal instruments, last year in my own town of London, Ontario, where my family lives, 2 or 3 guys ran a car over a sidewalk and killed a family of 5 who were described as Islamic or Muslim in the newspaper, killing the grandmother, the couple, an older child, and leaving only a 9-year-old boy alive. They were charged with murder. So no system, regardless of how sophisticated it is perfect. There will still be people who resist immigration, who will resist newcomers of any kind. There were many other comments I had specifically on the 2 books, but I think that's the big picture I want to give you, because what both of you pointed out is it's the system that is going to make or break the success of newcomers to our countries. And if the system is on paper strong, that gives them a better chance. And I just wanted to highlight, because Canada is considered one of the best systems in the world, if not the best, it still is full of flaws, but it has many, many legal frameworks ending up, I will leave this on, I'll send it to Wing Kai, I guess is the best way. It leads up to the Refugee Act, is my point. So you have to have a strong institutional framework, but it doesn't mean that there won't be people who fall through the cracks, who get murdered on a street corner in a town where people, 99% of them have been happy to have refugees come in. So I'll stop there. And I guess one last comment I have is I love the.
I know Jessica has to probably leave soon. So before she leaves, I really like to thank Jessica and Heber for such enlightening and really thought-provoking discussion. It's really, the recording is available, so it will be distributed to a wider audience after we have a chance to look at it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
To meet everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah.
Bye.
Before Heber say bye, Heber, would you like to have a final comment as well?
I have to go. I'm so sorry. I have another meeting coming up.
Okay.
Bye. Thank
Sounds
you.
good.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. So we
Bye.
will keep up with that. Thank you, Janet.
Sure. I'm going to send my notes on the 2 books to the authors as well as you. Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Bye. Hi, Meta. How are you? I got your message. I figured I'd see you today.
Yeah.